In the bitter winter of 1879, behind St. Stephen's Church in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, authorities made a discovery that would haunt the coal region for generations to come. When the previous rector, Reverend William Hayes, had died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving the congregation spiritually adrift during one of the deadliest periods in the mine's history. In his first 6 months alone, Thompson conducted 14 funerals, more than his predecessor had in 2 years. But Thompson offered more than just spiritual comfort. He introduced something revolutionary to St. Stephen's, a church-sponsored life insurance program. "My dear brothers and sisters," Thompson announced from the pulpit on a crisp October Sunday in 1867, his voice carrying the weight of divine mission, "I have witnessed too much suffering in our community. Too many widows left destitute, too many children orphaned not just of their fathers, but of any hope for their future. The Lord calls us to prepare for tomorrow, not merely to pray for it." The program was simple and profoundly appealing. Church members could purchase life insurance policies through a company Thompson had partnered with, Keystone Mutual Assurance of Philadelphia. The premiums were remarkably affordable, especially compared to other companies that viewed coal mining as too high risk. A miner could insure his life for $500, nearly 2 years' wages, for just 50 cents a month. Upon presentation of a death certificate, widows would receive immediate payment. No questions asked, no lengthy investigations. Within 6 months, over 200 families had enrolled. What made Thompson's program especially attractive was his personal touch with bereaved families. Unlike other insurers that demanded extensive paperwork and delayed payments for months, Thompson personally guaranteed that families would receive their benefits within days of the burial. He handled all the paperwork, coordinated with the insurance company, and even advanced money from church funds if necessary to ensure no family suffered while awaiting their compensation. Dr. Cornelius Whitman, who had recently established his practice in Millbrook, became another crucial piece of this arrangement. A graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, Whitman was young, ambitious, and eager to build his reputation. He worked closely with Thompson, often waiving his fees for examining the deceased and providing death certificates for church members. This Christian charity, as Thompson called it, was presented as another blessing the Reverend had brought to their community. Completing this seemingly perfect support system for grieving families was Samuel Crow, the town's undertaker and sexton of St. Stephen's Cemetery. Crow, a somber man of 50 with prematurely white hair and hands permanently stained by his trade, had served Millbrook for 15 years. He offered payment plans for funerals, often accepting delayed payment until insurance benefits arrived. His prices were fair, his service dignified, and his discretion absolute. This trinity of care, spiritual, medical, and practical, made St. Stephen's Church a beacon of hope in a community where death was a constant companion. Families felt protected, knowing their loved ones would be cared for in death and that those left behind would be provided for. The arrangement seemed like a godsend. And perhaps, that was precisely how it was designed to appear. The first sign that something was terribly amiss came on a bitter February morning in 1868, though it would be 11 years before anyone understood its significance. Thomas McKenna was walking to his shift at the Millbrook mine when he spotted a familiar figure trudging along the railroad tracks leading out of town. The man was thin, dressed in rough work clothes, and walked with a distinctive limp that McKenna recognized instantly. It was James Morrison, a fellow miner and member of St. Stephen's. The problem was, McKenna had attended Morrison's funeral just 3 weeks earlier. McKenna called out, but the distant figure didn't respond. By the time McKenna reached the spot, the tracks were empty. The early morning mist rising from the coal tipple made visibility poor, and McKenna convinced himself he had been mistaken. Grief and guilt could play cruel tricks on a man's mind, he knew that from experience. Morrison had been crushed by a falling support beam in a mine accident, and McKenna, working the same shaft, blamed himself for not warning his friend quickly enough. So, McKenna said nothing. What could he say? That he'd seen a dead man walking the tracks. People would think the coal dust had finally addled his brain. But Thomas McKenna wasn't the only one having such encounters. Over the following months, other residents reported similar eerie sightings. Mary Sullivan swore she saw her deceased husband, Patrick, buying supplies at a general store in the neighboring town of Centralia. Agnes Fletcher claimed her late son, Benjamin, had appeared at her kitchen window one evening, thinner than she remembered, but unmistakably her boy. Each sighting was dismissed by the witnesses themselves, tricks of the light, figments of a grief-stricken imagination, simple cases of mistaken identity. Yet the reports shared disturbing similarities. These ghosts were always seen at a distance, always in neighboring towns, and always appeared more haggard and emaciated than in life. They never responded to calls, never approached their former neighbors, and seemed to vanish into thin air when pursued. When consulted about these visions, Reverend Thompson offered comfort with a theological explanation. Grief manifests in mysterious ways, he counseled from the pulpit. The mind, in its desperate need to hold on to what is lost, sometimes creates what the heart most desires to see. These visions are not supernatural visitations, but rather the natural response of souls struggling to accept God's will. His explanations were reasonable, compassionate, and utterly wrong. The reality was far more systematic and infinitely more cruel. What had truly happened to James Morrison was this. On January 15, 1868, Morrison had reported to Dr. Whitman complaining of severe chest pains and difficulty breathing, common symptoms among miners, often signaling the onset of pneumoconiosis, the black lung disease. Whitman examined him thoroughly and delivered the devastating news: Morrison was dying. The disease had progressed too far, he had weeks, perhaps months, to live. Morrison was a 34-year-old man with a wife and 3 young children. His life insurance policy would provide $500, barely enough to cover his medical care, let alone support his family after he was gone. In his desperation, Morrison made a decision that would condemn him to a fate worse than the disease ravaging his lungs. Dr. Whitman presented him with an alternative. "There is another way," Whitman had said quietly, after ensuring his office door was locked. "A way your family could receive the insurance money immediately, while you address your situation through other means." The proposal was elegantly simple and utterly damning. Morrison would be declared dead from acute heart failure, a common enough cause among miners to raise no suspicion. His body would be prepared for burial by Crow, his funeral conducted by Thompson, and his family would receive their payout within days. Morrison himself would be transported to work in the deep mines of western Pennsylvania, where labor was desperately needed and questions were never asked. He could work until his disease claimed him naturally, all while knowing his family was provided for. "You're dying anyway," Whitman had explained with clinical detachment. "This way, your death serves a purpose. Your family benefits, and you contribute to the industrial progress of our great state. It is a Christian solution to an unfortunate situation." In cases of lung disease, Crow would explain to grieving families, the body deteriorates quickly after death. For the health and comfort of the bereaved, immediate sealing is recommended. The funeral services themselves were elaborate and emotionally overwhelming, designed to prevent close scrutiny. Thompson's sermons during these occasions were particularly powerful, focusing on themes of sacrifice, redemption, and the mysterious ways of divine providence. The emotional intensity left families drained and grateful, not suspicious. Between 1868 and 1870, 12 more men were processed through this system. Each case followed the same pattern: terminal diagnosis or devastating injury, a consultation with Dr. Whitman, a private meeting with Reverend Thompson, a staged death, an elaborate funeral, an immediate insurance payout, and transportation to a remote mining operation. The victims were typically men in their 30s and 40s, old enough to have substantial family responsibilities, but young enough to provide years of hard labor. They came from various backgrounds within the Protestant community: Welsh miners, German railroad workers, Irish farmers who had turned to mining after crop failures. What they shared was desperation and the belief they were making a noble sacrifice for their families. None realized they were being sold into slavery. The mining operations that purchased these men were concentrated in remote areas of western Pennsylvania, where the demand for expendable labor was enormous and regulation was minimal. These weren't established companies with safety protocols. They were illegal or quasi-legal operations extracting coal from dangerous, unstable deposits using methods legitimate companies had abandoned as too risky. Workers faced conditions that made normal mining seem safe: 12 to 16-hour shifts in poorly ventilated tunnels, outdated and malfunctioning equipment, and life in overcrowded barracks with inadequate food and medical care. Death rates were astronomical, but the operators didn't care. Replacements were always available through contacts like Thompson. The men who survived more than a few months became shells of their former selves. The combination of extreme physical labor, poor nutrition, constant danger, and complete isolation from their families broke their spirits as effectively as the work broke their bodies. Even if they had escaped, they faced the impossible task of explaining their return from the dead to families who had mourned them and collected insurance money based on their demise. This psychological trap was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire system. The victims became complicit in their own enslavement, unable to reveal the truth without destroying the families they had supposedly died to protect. By 1870, Thompson's operation had generated over $6,500 in insurance payouts, a fortune for the time. More importantly, it had established him as one of the most trusted and beloved figures in Millbrook. His church membership grew dramatically, drawn by his practical approach to family security and his genuine seeming concern. The Keystone Mutual Assurance Company, far from being suspicious of the high death rate, was pleased with the arrangement. Thompson's prompt documentation and lack of disputed claims made Millbrook one of their most profitable markets. They even began recommending his methods to other agents as an example of effective customer service. But the system's very success would lead to its expansion and its eventual exposure. Thompson had created something too profitable to remain small, too successful to avoid attention, and too dependent on human misery to continue indefinitely without consequence. The shadows of the past were about to give way to the conspiracy's darkest chapter. As Thompson prepared to scale his operation to levels that would ultimately doom it, what had begun with one desperate miner would soon encompass entire families. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was not whether Thompson and his associates were criminals. That would become undeniably clear. The question was whether they had convinced themselves they were doing God's work, or whether they had simply discovered that evil, when dressed in religious clothing and presented with compassionate rhetoric, could flourish in plain sight within a community desperate enough to believe in miracles. The transformation from opportunistic crime to systematic atrocity began in the spring of 1871 with an unexpected visitor who would change everything. Colonel Harrison Blackwood arrived in Millbrook on a Thursday morning, stepping off the Pennsylvania Railroad in an expensive suit and carrying leather satchels that suggested serious business. A Civil War veteran turned industrialist, Blackwood operated mining concerns in the most remote and dangerous locations in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. What Blackwood offered Thompson was a dramatically expanded market for his unique services. Reverend Thompson, Blackwood explained in a private meeting at the church office, "I represent a consortium of mining operations that have been impressed by your innovative approach to labor acquisition. We have an immediate need for 500 able-bodied workers, and we're prepared to pay premium rates for rapid delivery." The math was staggering. At $75 per worker, triple Thompson's previous rate, this single contract would generate $37,500, more than most ministers earned in a lifetime. But Blackwood's proposal went far beyond simply expanding existing methods. "We're not just interested in the dying and desperate," Blackwood continued. "We need healthy workers who can contribute for years, not months. We're prepared to offer family packages, situations where entire households can benefit from relocation with generous compensation for wives and children." Thompson understood immediately. Instead of targeting only terminal cases, they would begin recruiting healthy workers under false pretenses, promising profitable employment in distant locations while actually delivering them into slavery. Families would receive. The Reverend had become an expert at reframing slavery as salvation, presenting the destruction of families as their protection. His ability to justify the unjustifiable through religious rhetoric had evolved into something approaching genuine delusion, or something far worse. Samuel Crow required no convincing. The undertaker had profited substantially and had developed a taste for the work that went beyond financial motivation. He began suggesting refinements to make the process more efficient and less conspicuous. "We need to vary our approach," Crow recommended. "Too many deaths from the same causes might eventually draw questions. I can arrange mining accidents, house fires, even drownings. Each method requires different preparation, but the results are equally effective." The first family processed under this expanded system was the Hendersons, Robert, his wife Sarah, and their 2 teenage sons, Michael and James. Robert was a skilled carpenter struggling to find work as mine construction slowed. Thompson approached him with an offer of lucrative employment building mining infrastructure in Colorado, with an immediate advance to help the family prepare for relocation. To Robert, it was an answer to prayer. The arrangement seemed generous and legitimate. Robert would travel ahead to establish housing and employment. Sarah and the boys would follow months later. To help with expenses, Thompson arranged for Robert to purchase a substantial life insurance policy, convertible to family coverage once they were settled in Colorado. What actually happened was that Robert was declared dead in a mining accident 2 weeks after his supposed departure. Sarah received a $1,000 insurance payout and a detailed account of her husband's tragic death in a tunnel collapse. She was told his body was too damaged to return, but that he'd been given a proper Christian burial by local authorities. 3 months later, Sarah and her sons were approached with a similar offer. Thompson explained that Robert had made arrangements before his death for his family to join him in Colorado, with associates who would honor his wishes. The insurance money would cover travel, and profitable employment awaited. Sarah, grieving and trusting the minister who had provided such comfort, agreed. She and her sons were given train tickets to what they believed was Colorado, but were actually transported to mining operations in remote West Virginia, where they joined Robert in conditions resembling a prison camp. The Henderson case established the template for family processing, a method that eliminated potential witnesses while maximizing insurance profits and labor yields. Between 1871 and 1875, Thompson processed 43 complete families through this system, generating over $85,000 in insurance payments while delivering nearly 200 workers to Blackwood's consortium. This expansion brought new risks. Unlike the original victims, these were healthy people connected to the community. Thompson needed new methods to explain their disappearances. His solution was brilliant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. He began spreading stories of religious revival movements in Western territories, communities of faithful Christians establishing new settlements based on biblical principles, necessarily severing ties with their past lives. "The Lord is calling his people to new lands," Thompson announced from his pulpit, just as he called Abraham, Moses from Egypt, the disciples from their nets. Some among us have heard this calling and chosen to answer, to sacrifice the comfort of familiar surroundings for the greater glory of establishing God's kingdom in the wilderness. This religious framework provided perfect cover. When families vanished, the community assumed they joined these settlements and chosen to cut contact. It was unusual, but not unprecedented. Thompson even arranged for occasional letters to be sent to Millbrook, supposedly from families who had successfully established themselves. These letters, actually written by associates in distant cities, described successful farming, growing religious communities, and deep satisfaction. They reinforced the cover story while discouraging inquiry. By 1875, Thompson's operation was unprecedented in American criminal history, a systematic program of family destruction disguised as religious ministry, operating with the full trust of its victim community. The conspiracy had processed over 120 people, generated more than $150,000 in fraudulent insurance payments, and created a network of forced labor camps across 3 states. But its scale was creating insurmountable problems. The high disappearance rate was attracting attention from church authorities, insurance investigators, and law enforcement. More critically, some original victims had survived long enough in the labor camps to plan escapes, and their knowledge made them extremely dangerous. The shadows of the past were about to collide with the realities of the present, exposing secrets buried deeper than any of the empty coffins in St. Stephen's Cemetery. Just when we thought we understood the scope of Reverend Thompson's operation, we discover it was far more extensive and horrifying than anyone imagined. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our investigation into these forgotten crimes, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss stories that uncover the truth about America's hidden history. Now, let's see how this intricate web of deception began to unravel. The beginning of the end came from the last person anyone would have suspected, Rebecca Morrison, the the widow of James Morrison, Thompson's first victim from 7 years earlier. Rebecca had been one of Thompson's greatest success stories. After receiving her husband's insurance money in 1868, she used it to open a small boarding house for traveling salesmen and mining supervisors. The business prospered, and Rebecca became one of Millbrook's most respected widows, a living testament to the security Thompson's program provided. But Rebecca Morrison was also one of the few in Millbrook who read newspapers from other cities. In October 1875, while reviewing a Philadelphia paper left by a boarder, she noticed a small article about labor conditions in the anthracite mines near Centralia. It mentioned a mine accident that had killed 15 workers, including several whose backgrounds suggested they weren't typical miners. One name in the casualty list caught her eye: James Morrison, age 38, originally from the Schuylkill region. The age was wrong, her James would have been 41, but the name and origin created an impossible coincidence. How could there be another James Morrison from the same area, in the same industry, dying in a mine accident? Rebecca began collecting newspapers from other cities, searching for mentions of mining accidents, labor disputes, or unusual deaths. What she discovered over the following months chilled her to the bone. Names kept appearing, not just variations, but exact matches. Thomas McKenna, who had supposedly died of black lung in 1869. Patrick O'Sullivan, officially deceased in a mining accident in 1870. Benjamin Fletcher, a heart attack victim in 1871. The newspaper accounts described them as active workers who had died in various industrial accidents between 1872 and 1875, years after their official deaths and funerals in Millbrook. Rebecca faced an impossible situation. Either multiple men in Pennsylvania shared identical names with recently deceased members of her community, or the men she had mourned were still alive or had been alive for years after their supposed deaths. Her first instinct was to approach Reverend Thompson for guidance, but something made her hesitate. Perhaps it was a subtle memory of his too smooth explanations for previous strange occurrences. Instead, she decided to investigate on her own. Using her boarding house as a base, Rebecca corresponded with newspapers, coroners, and mining authorities in the regions where deceased Millbrook residents had supposedly died in accidents. Her questions were carefully framed as those of a grieving community member seeking to understand a tragic pattern. The responses painted a picture that defied all assumptions. Mining records showed James Morrison had been employed by the Centralia Deep Coal Company from March 1868 until his death in October 1875, a period beginning just 2 months after his Millbrook funeral. Employment records described him as a skilled miner recruited from eastern Pennsylvania. He had lived in company housing, received company pay, and was buried in the company cemetery after a tunnel collapse. The same pattern emerged for other names. Men mourned and buried in Millbrook had actually been working in remote mines for years after their deaths. They had used their real names, received wages, and interacted with other workers who knew them as living men. This forced a terrible conclusion: either the concept of death itself had become unreliable, or the men buried in St. Stephen's Cemetery weren't there at all. Rebecca made a decision that would expose the entire conspiracy. On a cold November night in 1875, she recruited her brother-in-law, Daniel Walsh, and 2 trusted neighbors to investigate James Morrison's grave. They chose his plot partly because Rebecca felt she had a right to know the truth, but mostly because it was isolated in the newer section of the cemetery. The 4 conspirators worked by lamplight, taking turns with shovels, expecting to find either human remains or evidence of desecration. What they found was a coffin full of stones and sawdust, carefully arranged to mimic the weight and dimensions of a human body. The discovery was devastating, but it created a new problem. Rebecca and her associates now had evidence of a crime, but they had obtained it illegally. Grave disturbance was a serious offense. More importantly, they had no idea how extensive the conspiracy was. If Thompson was involved, who else was complicit? Dr. Whitman had signed the death certificates. Samuel Crowe had prepared the bodies. Were local authorities involved? Insurance investigators? How deep did the corruption go? Rebecca decided to document her findings before approaching officials. Over the following weeks, she and her associates secretly examined 6 more graves, finding the same evidence each time: coffins filled with stones, but no human remains. Meanwhile, Thompson was sensing new risks. The expansion into family processing had created logistical challenges and increased the number of people with dangerous knowledge. Some processed families had extended relatives in other communities asking uncomfortable questions. Worse were reports from Blackwood's consortium about problems in the labor camps. Several original victims had survived longer than expected and were organizing resistance. Some escapes had been successful, and these men possessed intimate knowledge of Thompson's methods. Thompson began preparations for what he privately called Operational Conclusion, the systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses that would allow him to relocate and establish similar operations elsewhere. This included plans for dealing with community members who had discovered too much. Rebecca Morrison had no way of knowing her investigation had attracted Thompson's attention, or that her name was now on a list of people who posed unacceptable risks. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether the truth about St. Stephen's Church would be exposed or buried forever with its witnesses. Rebecca held evidence that could destroy Thompson's operation, but Thompson held power over an entire community and had the resources to eliminate a troublesome widow. The question was not whether they would clash, but whether anyone would survive to tell the story. The confrontation began on a grey December morning in 1875, when Rebecca made the mistake of trusting the wrong person with her terrible discovery. She decided to approach Dr. Whitman first, believing his medical training and professional ethics would make him a reliable ally. She reasoned that if he had been deceived, he would want to correct the record. If he was complicit, her approach would force him to reveal himself. She believed she could manage that risk. She was catastrophically wrong on both counts. When Rebecca presented her evidence to Dr. Whitman, showing him photographs of the opened graves and documentation of deceased miners working elsewhere, his reaction was immediate and chilling. "Mrs. Morrison," he said quietly, "you have made a very serious mistake coming here." Within hours, Rebecca found herself confronting not just Whitman's betrayal, but the full extent of the 7-year conspiracy. Thompson arrived at the office accompanied by Samuel Crowe and 2 rough-looking strangers who clearly weren't from Millbrook. "Rebecca," Thompson said, his pastoral voice devoid of its usual warmth, "you've discovered something that puts not just you, but your entire community at risk. The work we've been doing serves a greater purpose than you understand. The men you think we've wronged have contributed to industrial progress that benefits the entire nation. The families who received insurance payments have been saved from destitution. What seems like deception to you is actually a form of divine providence working through human agency." Thompson's attempt to justify the conspiracy through religious rhetoric revealed the complete moral corruption that had transformed him from minister to monster. But Rebecca was no longer the grieving widow who had accepted his comfort 7 years earlier. She had become an informed and determined adversary. "You're not serving God," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "You're serving yourself. You've turned our church into a slaughterhouse, our community into a hunting ground, and our faith into a marketplace for human souls. James is dead now, really dead. And so are all the others. They died as slaves in your minds, far from their families, believing they had sacrificed themselves for a noble purpose. You've committed murder, Reverend Thompson. Mass murder disguised as ministry." The accusation hit its target. Thompson's carefully constructed theological justifications crumbled under the weight of simple truth. For a moment, the mask of pastoral concern slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. "What you call murder, Mrs. Morrison, has provided security for dozens of families and productive labor for expanding industries. These men would have died anyway in our played-out mines, from black lung, from accidents. We simply redirected their deaths to serve a useful purpose." Dr. Whitman stepped forward, medical bag in hand. "Rebecca, you're clearly distraught. The evidence you think you found can be explained through rational means. Grave robbing is a serious crime, and the stress has obviously affected your mental state. I'm going to give you something to help you rest, and then we can discuss how to address this properly." But Rebecca had anticipated this. Before coming to Whitman's office, she had left detailed documentation with her brother-in-law, Daniel Walsh, with instructions to contact Philadelphia authorities if she didn't return by evening. She had also sent evidence to the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Pennsylvania State Police, though she hadn't mentioned this to anyone in Millbrook. "Dr. Whitman," Rebecca said, backing toward the door, "if you approach me with that bag, you'll be committing assault in front of witnesses. And gentlemen, if anything happens to me today, detailed evidence of your conspiracy will be in the hands of state authorities by tomorrow morning." The revelation that Rebecca had taken precautions beyond their control changed everything. Thompson and his associates faced a choice: immediate violence that would certainly expose them, or allowing Rebecca to leave with knowledge that might expose them eventually. Thompson chose a middle path that would be his final mistake. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, "you're acting on incomplete information. Yes, we have been creative in our methods of helping families in crisis, but you don't understand the full scope. Would you be willing to see the complete picture before making final judgments? Would you visit one of our operations, speak with the men you think are victims, see for yourself how they live and work?" It was a trap, of course. Thompson was offering Rebecca a visit to one of Blackwood's mines, where she would suffer a fatal accident. But Rebecca had spent months studying his methods and recognized the pattern. "I'll consider your offer," she replied carefully, "but only if you agree to my conditions. I want to visit accompanied by independent witnesses, representatives from the State Mining Authority or Philadelphia newspapers. I want advanced notice of exactly where we're going and when. And I want guarantees about communication with outside authorities during the visit." These conditions made the trap impossible to execute, but they also revealed that Rebecca understood his proposal perfectly. The pretense of peaceful resolution evaporated. Samuel Crow spoke for the first time, his voice flat and accustomed to death. "She knows too much, and she's prepared too well. This ends one of two ways: she disappears tonight, or we all hang next month." The blunt assessment forced everyone to confront the full implications. Thompson's conspiracy had grown too large to contain and too documented to deny. Rebecca possessed evidence that could destroy them all, and her precautions made it impossible to silence her without confirming her accusations. But after 7 years of building his operation, generating enormous profits, and convincing himself his crime served a higher purpose, Thompson wasn't prepared to surrender. "Mrs. Morrison," Thompson said finally, "I want you to understand something. The men in this room have committed themselves completely to our mission. We've moved beyond the point where retreat is possible. If our work is exposed, dozens of families will lose the insurance payments that have sustained them for years. Hundreds of workers will be abandoned in mining operations where they have no legal status or protection. The economic disruption alone will destroy this community." It was a desperate attempt at moral blackmail, suggesting that exposing the conspiracy would harm its victims. But Rebecca had anticipated this, too. "Reverend Thompson," she replied, "you're describing the consequences of your crimes, not reasons to continue committing them. Those families received money stolen through insurance fraud. Those workers are slaves who deserve rescue, not abandonment. And this community deserves the truth about what's been done in the name of Christian charity." The exchange marked the end of negotiation and the beginning of what Thompson called operational termination, the systematic elimination of threats. But Rebecca had made one final preparation Thompson couldn't have anticipated. As she spoke her last words in Whitman's office, 2 Pennsylvania State Police investigators were already on a train to Millbrook, summoned by the evidence she had mailed to Harrisburg 3 days earlier. They arrived that evening armed with warrants and accompanied by federal marshals who had been investigating reports of forced labor. The confrontation in Dr. Whitman's office was interrupted by the sound of horses and carriages outside, sounds that marked the beginning of the largest criminal investigation in Pennsylvania's history and the end of Thompson's reign. What happened next would expose not just the scope of Thompson's conspiracy, but the horrifying conditions in the labor camps and the network of corruption that had allowed such systematic evil to flourish under the protection of religious authority. The arrest of Reverend Marcus Thompson, Dr. Cornelius Whitman, and Samuel Crow on December 15, 1875, began an investigation that exposed the largest human trafficking operation in American history to that date. Pennsylvania State Police Captain William McCready, who led the investigation, later wrote in his official report, "In 23 years of law enforcement, I have never encountered crimes of such scope and systematic cruelty." The conspiracy operated with the efficiency of a business enterprise and the moral authority of religious ministry, creating a perfect storm of exploitation that claimed at least 157 documented victims. The investigation revealed shocking details. Thompson's private journals, found in a hidden compartment in his church office, contained meticulous records of every victim. Each entry included the person's name, fictional cause of death, insurance payout, and destination in Blackwood's forced labor network. More disturbing were Thompson's theological justifications for each crime, written in the same hand that prepared his Sunday sermons. He had convinced himself he was conducting a form of divine selection, identifying those whose deaths could serve a greater purpose. His journals revealed a man who had lost all distinction between religious calling and criminal enterprise. Dr. Whitman's medical records provided evidence of the systematic targeting of victims. His patient files contained detailed assessments of medical conditions, family finances, social connections, and psychological vulnerabilities. Marginal notes included insurance value calculations and assessments of each patient's potential productivity as forced labor. Samuel Crow's workshop yielded the most physically disturbing evidence. Investigators found instructions for creating convincing corpses using sawdust, rags, and stones, along with tools for sealing coffins immediately after viewing. They also discovered correspondence with suppliers, revealing the deception required ongoing purchases of specialized equipment. The investigation of Blackwood's mining operations required coordination between state authorities in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. They discovered a network of illegal mining concerns operating under conditions resembling antebellum slavery. Workers were housed in overcrowded barracks, fed minimal rations, worked 12 to 16-hour shifts, and received no wages beyond basic subsistence. Most shocking was the discovery that many of Thompson's victims were still alive. Rescue operations at 14 different mining sites freed 87 survivors, though most were in such poor physical and psychological condition they required months of medical care before testifying. The survivor testimonies painted a picture of systematic psychological torture designed to prevent escape and resistance. Workers were told their families believed them dead and had moved on. They were informed that returning home would result in insurance fraud charges for themselves and their families. They were deliberately isolated to prevent supportive relationships or organized resistance. James Morrison, Rebecca's husband and Thompson's first victim, was among the survivors rescued from a mine near Centralia. He had been in forced labor for 7 years and 11 months. His reunion with Rebecca became one of the most documented and emotionally powerful moments of the investigation, symbolizing both the horror of Thompson's crimes and the possibility of justice and recovery. The legal proceedings were unprecedented in scope and complexity. Thompson, Whitman, Crow, and 37 associates were charged with crimes ranging from insurance fraud and kidnapping to involuntary servitude and conspiracy to commit murder. The trials required testimony from over 200 witnesses and examination of thousands of documents spanning nearly a decade. Thompson's defense team argued he had genuinely believed he was helping families and that mining conditions were beyond his knowledge. This strategy collapsed when prosecutors presented his private journals, which clearly documented his awareness of the true conditions and his active participation in maintaining them. The most damning evidence came from Thompson's own words, written after visiting a mining operation in 1874, "The Lord works in mysterious ways, transforming what appears to be suffering into divine purpose. These men sacrifice their earthly comfort so that their families may prosper and industry may advance. Their temporary hardship serves eternal purposes that they cannot comprehend but must trust in faith." Dr. Whitman claimed he had been deceived by Thompson and believed he was participating in a legitimate insurance program. This was undermined by evidence showing he had personally visited mining operations, examined working conditions, and recommended changes to improve worker productivity rather than welfare. Samuel Crow offered no defense beyond claiming he followed orders and assumed others understood the legal implications. His cooperation with prosecutors, including detailed explanations of his methods for creating fake corpses and staging funerals, secured him a reduced sentence but provided some of the most disturbing testimony. The trials concluded in October 1876 with convictions on virtually all charges. Thompson was sentenced to life imprisonment at Eastern State Penitentiary, where he died in 1891, still maintaining in his final letters that he had been doing God's work through unconventional means. Whitman received 25 years and served 18 before dying from consumption in 1894. Crowe was sentenced to 15 years, released in 1889, after which he disappeared from historical records. The investigation's impact extended far beyond individual prosecutions. It led to significant reforms in insurance regulation, including requirements for independent verification of deaths and mandatory waiting periods before benefit payments. It also resulted in new federal legislation regarding mining working conditions and the prosecution of forced labor. For Millbrook, the revelations created generational trauma. Families who had mourned loved ones discovered their grief had been manipulated for profit. Community members who had trusted Thompson's guidance realized they had lived under a criminal enterprise disguised as religious ministry. The psychological impact was particularly severe for families who had received insurance payments based on false deaths. Many felt compelled to return money they had spent on homes, businesses, and education, even though they were victims, not participants. The moral complexity of having benefited financially from unknown crimes created guilt and shame that affected the community for decades. St. Stephen's Church never recovered. Attendance dropped to under 30 members by 1877, and the building was sold to the Catholic diocese in 1879. The cemetery remained under community control, but many families relocated the graves of legitimately deceased relatives to other burial grounds, unable to distinguish real from fake burials without expensive exhumations. Rebecca Morrison became a national figure, celebrated in newspapers as the brave widow who exposed one of America's most heinous criminal conspiracies. She used her prominence to advocate for insurance reform and support for trafficking victims, speaking at conferences and meeting with legislators until her death in 1923. The empty coffins of St. Stephen's Church became a symbol of how evil could flourish under the protection of religious authority and community trust. The case was used in law enforcement training for decades, demonstrating how criminals could exploit social institutions and human vulnerabilities to conduct systematic atrocities in plain sight. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that Thompson's operation had been entirely preventable. Multiple people had reported seeing deceased individuals in neighboring towns, but these reports were dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations rather than investigated as potential evidence of crime. The authority granted to religious figures and medical professionals had created an environment where their word was rarely questioned, even when evidence suggested serious problems. The final tally was staggering: 157 documented victims, $847,000 in fraudulent insurance payments, over $20 million today, and a forced labor network that had enslaved hundreds across multiple states. The human cost was incalculable: families destroyed, communities traumatized, faith in religious authority permanently damaged. But the most chilling aspect was Thompson's final statement before sentencing, delivered without apparent remorse or recognition of his crime's true nature: "I have served God's purpose in ways that others cannot understand." The men who worked in those mines contributed to America's industrial progress. The families who received insurance payments were saved from destitution. The efficiency of our methods allowed us to help more people than traditional charity could ever reach. History will vindicate the necessity of what we accomplished. This statement revealed that Thompson had never understood the evil of his actions. He had created a theological framework that transformed slavery into salvation, murder into ministry, and systematic exploitation into divine service. His ability to maintain these delusions even after exposure and conviction demonstrated the dangerous power of ideological justification to corrupt moral reasoning. The story of St. Stephen's Church and its empty coffins serves as a permanent reminder that the greatest evils often wear the mask of the greatest good, that authority without accountability breeds corruption, and that the price of community trust must never be the abandonment of individual vigilance. Rebecca Morrison's courage in investigating the impossible and confronting the unthinkable prevented Thompson's conspiracy from claiming more victims and ensured that the truth, however horrible, would not remain buried with its evidence. This mystery shows us that evil can flourish in the most unexpected places, protected by the very institutions meant to safeguard human dignity and spiritual welfare. What do you think of this story? Do you believe communities today are better protected against such systematic deception? Or could similar conspiracies still operate under the cover of religious or charitable authority? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling and want to hear more stories about America's hidden criminal history, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of uncovering buried truths. Until next time, remember that the most important stories are often the ones that powerful people hoped would never be told.